Billionaire's daughter falsely accuses her dad's driver of rat pound. 3 years later, he sought revenge. James had always believed that hard work and honesty were the keys to a good life. For the past 5 years, he had been the personal driver for one of the wealthiest men in the city, Mr. Richard. Every morning, he would wake up before the sun, iron his uniform to perfection, and make sure the car was spotless before heading to the grand estate. Unlike many of the other staff members who whispered behind their boss's back, James respected Mr. Richard. He was strict but fair, and he had given James a stable job that helped him support his mother and plan for a future with the woman he loved. Lucy, his fiancée, was everything to him. They had been together for years, saving up for a small house where they could build their life. James worked long hours, often missing important moments with her, but he always reminded her that their sacrifices would be worth it. Lucy believed in him, but she sometimes worried that he was too trusting, especially when it came to the people he worked for. Mr. Richard's daughter, Mary, had never known struggle. Born into wealth, she had been spoiled from the moment she could walk. Expensive clothes, luxurious vacations, and endless attention were all she had ever known. People bent over backward to please her, and she had grown used to getting her way. But there was one thing she hated more than anything: being ignored. James had always been polite to her, but unlike the other men in her life, he never flirted back or acted impressed by her beauty. To Mary, that was unacceptable. She saw him as a challenge, a game she needed to win. And when she didn't get what she wanted, she had no problem ruining someone's life just to prove a point. Mary had always been surrounded by men who would do anything to impress her. Whether it was waiters at high-end restaurants, her father's business associates, or even her own friends' boyfriends, they all looked at her with admiration, desperate for her attention. But James was different. He was polite, respectful, but distant. No matter how many times she tried to strike up a conversation or flash him a charming smile, he never looked at her the way other men did. That intrigued her. At first, she thought it was just because he was shy or intimidated by her wealth. But as weeks turned into months, she realized something frustrating. James simply wasn't interested. And that drove her crazy. She started finding excuses to be around him more, purposely leaving things in the car so she had a reason to call him back. She would brush her hand against his when he handed her the car door, linger a little too long when saying thank you, and dress in a way that she knew caught men's attention. But no matter what she did, James remained unchanged. He treated her the same way he treated everyone else, respectful but distant. One evening, she found herself alone in the house while her father was away on a business trip. The staff was busy, and she knew James would be in the garage, checking on the cars as he always did before heading home. A wicked idea crossed her mind, and without thinking twice, she made her way down the long hallway, her heart racing with anticipation. She pushed open the garage door, her eyes locking onto James, who was wiping down the windshield of her father's car. He looked up, surprised to see her standing there. Before he could ask what she needed, she stepped forward, lowering her voice to a soft, almost seductive tone. "James," she said, tilting her head slightly, "do you ever get tired of always following the rules?" James stiffened, instantly sensing where this was going. He placed the cloth down and took a small step back. "Miss Mary, is there something you need?" he asked, keeping his tone polite but firm. Mary ignored his question and closed the distance between them. "You work so hard. Don't you ever want to enjoy life a little?" she murmured, reaching out to touch his arm. James immediately pulled away, his heart pounding, not out of attraction but discomfort. "Mary, please," he said, his voice steady. "This isn't right." Mary's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time, her sweet, playful expression turned into something darker. "Why?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Because you think you're better than me?" James sighed, shaking his head. "No, because I love Lucy. I respect her, and I respect myself." That was the moment Mary's obsession turned into anger. No one had ever rejected her before. No one had ever told her no. She clenched her fists at her sides, her face flushing with humiliation. "You'll regret this, James," she muttered under her breath before turning sharply on her heel and walking away. And in that moment, James had no idea just how serious she was. Mary stormed back to her room, slamming the door so hard that the walls seemed to shake. Her face was flushed with anger and humiliation, and her hands trembled as she paced the floor. No one had ever dared to reject her before, especially not a driver. The more she thought about James's words, the more her fury grew. How dare he turn her down? How dare he make her feel powerless? As the minutes passed, her anger twisted into something colder, something meaner. If James wanted to play the noble hero, she would make sure that choice destroyed him. Her eyes fell on the full-length mirror across the room, and a dark idea crept into her mind. Without giving herself time to reconsider, she took a deep breath, gripped the neckline of her expensive dress, and tore it roughly down the side. The fabric ripped with a sharp sound, exposing her shoulder and part of her back. She messed up her hair with shaky hands, smudged her mascara to look like she'd been crying, and took a step back, examining the reflection. The frightened, disheveled girl staring back was almost convincing. For a moment, even she felt a chill at how real it seemed. She didn't hesitate. Stumbling out into the hallway, she took a deep breath, then screamed at the top of her lungs. The sound was shrill and desperate, echoing off the marble floors and high ceilings. "Help! Please, someone help me!" she cried, her voice breaking with fake sobs. Within seconds, heavy footsteps thundered through the corridor, and Mr. Richard appeared, his eyes wide with panic. A few security guards rushed behind him, but Mr. Richard was the first to reach her, his face pale as he took in her torn dress and trembling figure. "Mary, what happened? Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands gripping her shoulders tightly. Mary collapsed against him, burying her face into his chest, her shoulders shaking with carefully practiced sobs. It's James," she choked out, her voice small and broken. He tried to force himself on me, Dad. I tried to get away, but..." Her voice cracked, and she let out another sob for effect, clutching at her father's shirt. Mr. Richard's expression shifted in an instant. Shock turned to rage, dark and dangerous, twisting his features. His jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle ticked at the side of his face. "Where is he?" he growled, his voice low and furious. Before Mary could even respond, he was already moving, barking orders at the guards to find James immediately. James was in the servants' quarters, finishing up for the day, when the door burst open with such force that it crashed against the wall. He barely had time to turn before two guards grabbed him roughly, shoving him forward. Confusion flashed across his face, quickly replaced by alarm. "What's going on?" he demanded, struggling against their iron grip. But before he could get an answer, Mr. Richard stepped forward, eyes blazing with fury. "You disgusting piece of trash," Mr. Richard spat, his voice like venom. "How dare you lay a hand on my daughter?" James's blood turned to ice. The accusation didn't make sense. It felt like a bad dream, blurry and unreal. "Sir, wait. I don't understand. What are you talking about?" he stammered, his heart pounding painfully in his chest. "Save your lies," Mr. Richard snapped, his face twisted with hatred. "Mary told me everything. You're going to rot in prison for what you did." The words crashed over James like icy water, leaving him breathless and stunned. As the guards dragged him away, his wide eyes caught Mary's from down the hall. She stood in her father's arms, her face pale and tear-streaked, but for just a fraction of a second, he saw it, the slight curl of her lips, a cold, satisfied smirk that vanished the moment she saw him looking. And in that moment, James understood. This wasn't a nightmare. It was something much worse. The handcuffs were cold and uncomfortably tight around James's wrists as the officers shoved him into the back of the police car. Red and blue lights flashed wildly, reflecting off the polished marble of the mansion's driveway. His mind was spinning, still unable to process what was happening. The words tumbled out of him in a frantic rush as he struggled against the officer's hold. "Please, you've got it all wrong. I didn't touch her. I would never do that. You have to believe me," he pleaded, his voice raw with desperation. But no one listened. The officers ignored his protests, slamming the door shut with a finality that sent a shiver down his spine. From the entrance of the mansion, Mr. Richard stood like a statue, his face shadowed with disgust and rage. Mary leaned against him, her eyes red and swollen. But James could see the way she clung to her father, her fingers curling into the fabric of his suit with a grip that seemed almost too firm for someone so shaken. When James's eyes met hers through the car window, she looked away quickly, burying her face into her father's chest. It was in that moment that the horrible truth settled into his bones. She wasn't going to tell the truth. No one was. As the car pulled away, leaving the mansion's iron gates behind, James's heart pounded with a mix of fear and disbelief. The ride to the station was a blur of police radios crackling and the muffled sound of his own breathing. By the time they dragged him into a holding cell, the story had already hit the news. Headlines screamed from every television screen in the station. Billionaire's driver accused of assault. His mugshot flashed beside photos of Mary looking heartbroken and fragile, her eyes downcast, a tear caught just beneath her lashes. The reporters' voices droned on, filling in details that were all wrong but sounded so convincing. The next day, when they allowed him one phone call, James's hands shook as he dialed Lucy's number, praying she would pick up, that she would believe him. The phone rang twice before she answered, but the voice that came through wasn't the warm, loving one he knew. It was cold and sharp. "How could you, James?" Lucy's voice cracked with anger and something deeper, betrayal. "I saw it all on the news. I can't believe I trusted you." "Lucy, please, you have to listen to me," James begged, his voice breaking. "It's not true. I swear on everything I love, I didn't touch her. You know me. You know I would never." "Don't," Lucy snapped, cutting him off. Her breathing was ragged, and he could almost picture the tears in her eyes. "Don't say another word. I can't even look at you right now. We're done, James. Don't ever call me again." And then there was only the empty click of the line going dead, leaving James to stare blankly at the phone, numbness creeping into his chest. Days blurred together in the dim light of the cell. Guards avoided his eyes. His lawyer was cold and distant, and the trial date was set faster than he could comprehend. Each time Mr. Richard appeared at the hearings, his eyes were filled with an icy hatred that left no room for doubt. He wouldn't listen to a single word James said. "Save your breath," Mr. Richard sneered once, his voice low and deadly. "You're nothing but a liar and a monster. I trusted you with my family, and you betrayed me." Every denial, every desperate attempt to explain the truth was met with deaf ears. James had never felt so helpless in his life, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. And as the cell door clanged shut behind him each night, he couldn't stop replaying that last look on Mary's face, the small, satisfied smirk hidden behind a mask of tears. The judge's words echoed in James's ears long after they had been spoken. 20 years. The courtroom had fallen into a heavy silence, but to James, it felt deafening. His legs went weak, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse. It was over. The gavel struck with a finality that made his heart lurch, and the guards were already at his sides, dragging him away before he could even try to speak. His eyes searched desperately through the crowd, hoping to find at least one familiar face, one person who might believe him. But all he saw were cold stares and whispered accusations. Mr. Richard's gaze was hard and unfeeling. Mary's was hidden behind a veil of tears that he knew were as fake as the words that had condemned him. By the time they threw him into the prison van, James's hands were trembling uncontrollably. The metal cuffs bit into his wrists, but the pain was distant, drowned out by the crushing realization that he was alone. The drive to the prison was long and suffocating, the guards refusing to answer his questions or even look at him. The moment he was processed and his fingerprints were taken, they shoved him into a narrow cell with peeling gray walls and a cot that smelled of sweat and despair. The door slammed shut with a clang that seemed to echo forever. Days blurred into weeks, each one worse than the last. Word of his crimes spread quickly, and inmates weren't known for mercy. Guards sneered when they handed him his meals, some making crude comments under their breath. The other prisoners eyed him with a mix of hatred and twisted amusement. It didn't take long for the threats to start. Shoves in the corridors, stolen meals, fists against his ribs in dark corners where the cameras didn't see. Each day was a battle to survive, to keep his head down and avoid the eyes that burned with contempt. His body grew thinner, bruises blossomed beneath his uniform. But the worst wounds were the ones that didn't show, the ones that kept him up at night, staring at the cracked ceiling and wondering how everything had gone so wrong. Letters from Lucy never came. His old friends never visited. Mr. Richard had made sure the world believed the worst of him, and the world was all too eager to listen. But not Ella. She was the only one who hadn't turned her back. Every week, she was there, sitting across from him in the cold visiting room with eyes full of sympathy and determination. Her visits were a lifeline, the only thing keeping him from drowning completely. She would bring him what little she could: books, letters from his mother, small things that reminded him there was still someone who cared. "I know you didn't do it," Ella would say, her hands warm and steady over his shaking ones. Her voice was always soft but fierce, a promise that she would never stop believing in him. At first, James had struggled to even look her in the eyes, shame twisting in his gut. But as the months dragged on, those moments were the only ones where he could almost breathe again. "I'm going to prove it," Ella would insist, her eyes bright with determination. "I don't know how yet, but I swear I'll find a way to clear your name." James wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe there was still hope, that someone would uncover the truth and pull him out of this nightmare. But the days were long and cruel, and each one chipped a little more away from him. Most nights, he lay awake on the thin cot, clutching Ella's letters like a lifeline and repeating her words in his mind, trying desperately to believe them. But hope was a fragile thing, and 20 years was a long time. 3 years passed, dragging by like a slow, painful march. James counted every day from behind the cold walls of his cell, each one feeling heavier than the last. Outside, the world moved on, but inside the mansion, things were beginning to crack. Mary had grown bolder, her guilt buried beneath layers of entitlement and arrogance. With James out of the way, she returned to her parties, her shopping sprees, and her endless demands on her father. Mr. Richard, eager to forget the scandal that had nearly tainted his family's name, gave her whatever she wanted without question. But he never once looked at the security footage stored in his office, the recordings from the hidden cameras he'd had installed years ago to keep an eye on the staff. Mary, confident that her lies were buried for good, grew careless. She no longer bothered to hide the way she treated the servants, snapping at them in the hallways, throwing tantrums when things didn't go her way. A few times, she even let something slip, small, careless comments when she thought no one was listening. The other staff members exchanged uneasy glances, whispers spreading quietly through the kitchen and servant quarters. But no one dared say anything aloud. No one except Ella. Ella had taken a job at the mansion shortly after James's trial, keeping her head down and her eyes open. She scrubbed floors and carried trays, all the while watching, listening, waiting for something, anything, that might prove James's innocence. She saw the way Mary flinched at the mention of James's name, the way her eyes darted away too quickly whenever someone brought up that night. And the more Ella watched, the more she was convinced that Mary was hiding something. One afternoon, while clearing Mr. Richard's study, Ella's eyes drifted to the computer on the massive oak desk. The screen was dark, the files locked behind layers of passwords, but she noticed a small folder icon labeled security. Her heart thumped painfully in her chest. She remembered how James had once mentioned that Mr. Richard was paranoid about security, that cameras covered nearly every inch of the house. If those cameras had been rolling the night Mary made her accusation, Ella's hands trembled at the thought. She started asking questions, careful and subtle. A comment to the cook here, a question to the gardener there, piecing together fragments of conversations. The older housekeeper, who had worked for Mr. Richard for decades, mentioned in passing how Mr. Richard had installed cameras everywhere after a break-in scare. "Not that he ever bothers to check them," she had huffed, shaking her head. "Rich people and their toys." But Ella's pulse quickened at the information. If the cameras had caught what really happened that night, the truth might still be out there, buried but not gone. That night, she stayed awake long after the other staff had gone to bed, lying in the dark with her mind racing. If she was right, if the footage still existed, then it might be the only chance to save James. But getting to it wouldn't be easy. Mr. Richard's study was locked most of the time, and security prowled the hallways at all hours. One wrong move, and she could end up in a cell right next to James. But every time she thought of giving up, she pictured his face the last time she had visited. The hollow eyes, the way his voice had cracked when he tried to thank her for not abandoning him. No, she couldn't turn back now. She made her decision quietly, the resolve settling deep in her bones. She would find a way into that office, and if the footage was there, she would get it. No matter what it took. Ella's hands trembled as she smoothed down the plain black dress of her new uniform, her heart pounding so hard she was sure someone would hear it. The mansion loomed above her, grand and cold, its marble columns and glittering windows casting long shadows across the driveway. It felt wrong to be back here, to walk the same halls where James's life had been destroyed. But she forced herself to take a steadying breath, to lift her chin and step forward. She wasn't here to grieve. She was here to find the truth. Getting the job had been easier than she'd expected. The turnover among the staff was high. Most couldn't stand Mary's tantrums and Mr. Richards' demanding schedule for long. When Ella had shown up at the servants' entrance, her eyes downcast and her resume in hand, the head housekeeper barely glanced at her before shoving a mop into her arms and showing her to a small room in the servants' quarters. No one recognized her. No one cared who she was, just as long as she did her job without complaint. It was perfect. Days passed slowly, each one a careful game of watching and waiting. Ella cleaned floors, polished silver, and delivered trays to Mary's room, all the while listening, taking note of every door code and security camera. It was on her third day, while dusting the shelves in Mr. Richards' study, that she saw it, a folder icon on the computer desktop labeled security footage. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she could only stare. If the footage was still there, if it showed what really happened that night, it could be enough to save James. But before she could take a step closer, a door creaked open, and Mr. Richards' voice floated down the hall. Ella's heart nearly stopped as she snatched up her dusting cloth and hurried out, barely slipping into the corridor before he entered the study. That night, alone in her tiny room, Ella's mind raced with possibilities. She knew she had to get back into that study, but the door was always locked, and guards patrolled the hallway outside. Mr. Richard kept the keys on him at all times, and the computer was password protected. It would take more than luck to get to that footage. She would need a plan, and a dangerous one at that. But as she stared at the ceiling, replaying James's last words to her, the way his voice had cracked when he'd said, "I don't think I can hold on much longer," Ella's fear hardened into something stronger. The next morning, she began to move with careful purpose. A stolen glance at Mr. Richards' key ring when he wasn't looking, a few friendly words to the guard who lingered by the front door during lunch. Each step was small and cautious, but necessary. She started working later shifts, offering to clean the east wing after the other maids had left, inching her way closer to the study each night. Every second she spent in that house was a risk. If anyone realized who she was or why she was really there, it would all be over. But every time she hesitated, she thought of James sitting alone in that cell, innocent and broken, and her resolve returned sharper than before. She had come this far, given up everything to prove his innocence. There was no turning back now. She would get into that office, find the footage, and finally, the truth would come out. No matter what it cost her. The mansion was alive with music and laughter, every room glowing with golden light. Crystal glasses clinked, heels clicked against marble floors, and perfume hung heavy in the air. Guests in glittering dresses and sharp suits filled the halls, their voices blending into a low hum of polite conversation and shallow compliments. Mary was at the center of it all, draped in a gown that sparkled under the chandeliers, her laughter bright and hollow. Mr. Richard smiled stiffly beside her, shaking hands with old business partners and offering practice smiles to their wives. It was the perfect distraction. Ella moved quickly through the back corridors, keeping her head down and her eyes sharp. The kitchen was a frenzy of activity, chefs shouting orders, servers rushing trays of hors d'oeuvres in and out. No one paid her any mind as she slipped down the servants' stairwell and into the east wing, the music and laughter fading with each step. Her palms were damp, and her heart hammered painfully in her chest, but her hands didn't shake as she pulled the stolen key from her pocket and slid it into the lock on Mr. Richards' study door. The door clicked open, and she slipped inside, closing it softly behind her. The study was dark, the heavy curtains drawn, but she didn't dare turn on the lights. She moved by memory to the desk, her fingers fumbling only slightly as she powered on the computer. The screen glowed to life, illuminating the dark wood and leather-bound books that lined the walls. The security footage folder was still there, exactly where she had seen it. Ella's breath came fast and shallow as she clicked it open, her eyes scanning the file names, dates, times, hallway angles. And then she found it, the night of the accusation. Her hands trembled as she opened the video, the screen flickering before settling into a grainy image of the hallway outside James's room. She watched, frozen, as the scene played out. Mary slipping into James's room uninvited, her voice sweet and coaxing. James backing away, hands up, voice steady but firm. Mary stepping closer, her expression twisting with frustration and something darker when he turned her down. And then, Mary's face contorted with anger, her hands tearing at her own dress, her screams splitting the silence as she stumbled back into the hallway, sobbing and shrieking for help. The door burst open, guards rushing in, and the video ended. Ella stared at the screen, Her breath caught somewhere between her throat and her lungs. There it was, proof. The truth. She snatched a USB drive from her pocket, her hands moving fast as she copied the footage, every second feeling like a countdown. Just as the transfer bar reached 100%, the door behind her swung open with a loud bang. Ella spun around, her heart leaping to her throat, but rough hands were already grabbing her arms, yanking her away from the computer. The USB clattered to the floor as the guards dragged her forward, one of them twisting her arms behind her back with a cruel grip that made her cry out. Well, came a cold, familiar voice. Mary stood in the doorway, her red lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor, and bent to pick up the USB. Turning it over between her fingers, she let out a soft, mocking laugh. "What exactly do you think you're doing, little maid?" she purred, tilting her head with faint curiosity. "Stealing from my father? That's a serious crime, you know." Ella gritted her teeth, glaring up at Mary with a defiance that hadn't dimmed in the slightest. "Your father will see what's on that drive," she snapped, her voice shaking but fierce. "Everyone will. They'll know what you did to James, what you really are." Mary's eyes flashed dangerously, and for a moment, the mask slipped, revealing something bitter and twisted beneath. But then she laughed again, a soft, condescending sound, and leaned in close, her breath warm and sickly sweet. "You're not going anywhere," she whispered, her smile widening. "And neither is this." Ella's heart pounded painfully, but she forced herself to hold Mary's gaze, to keep the fear from showing. Because despite the guard's iron grip, despite the odds stacked high against her, one thought burned bright and unyielding in her mind. James was innocent. And she wasn't done fighting yet. A merry smile faltered for the first time, the color draining slightly from her cheeks. She tightened her grip on the USB drive, her fingers trembling despite the smug tilt of her chin. For a moment, she just stared at Ella, eyes narrowed with a mix of disbelief and fury. Then, with a sharp breath, she straightened, forcing a laugh that came out brittle and thin. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice low and tight. "I don't think you understand what you're doing, little maid. Do you have any idea who my father is? Who I am?" Ella glared back, her wrists aching from the guard's iron grip, but her gaze didn't waver. "I know exactly who you are," she shot back, her voice cold. "And soon, so will everyone else." That was all it took to shatter the mask. Mary's eyes darkened, her lips twisting into a snarl. But just as quickly, her expression smoothed, replaced with a smile that was all teeth and poison. She took a slow breath, running a manicured finger along the edge of the USB drive. "Look," she said, her tone suddenly sweet, almost coaxing. "We don't have to do this. You're a smart girl, Ella. Brave, even. It'd be a shame for something bad to happen to you." She gestured slightly, and one of the guards eased his grip just enough for Ella to breathe, though his hands didn't leave her arms. Mary took a step closer, her heels clicking sharply on the floor, and leaned in until her perfume hung heavy in the air. "How much do you want?" she asked smoothly. "$1 million? 2. Name your price, and I'll make sure you're taken care of for life. All you have to do is hand over the original file and disappear. No one has to know." Ella's lip curled with disgust, but she forced herself to keep her voice steady, her glare fixed on Mary's cold blue eyes. "You're pathetic," she spat, every word dripping with contempt. "You think you can buy your way out of everything? Well, it's too late for that. I already sent the footage to the police." The smile vanished from Mary's face, her eyes widening with raw, unguarded panic. For a heartbeat, she just stared at Ella, the color draining completely from her face. Then, her expression twisted with fury. "You're lying," she snapped, her voice shaking. "You couldn't have. There's no way. Check your father's email." Ella cut in sharply, her chin lifting despite the guard's hold. "Or better yet, wait a few minutes and listen for the sirens." The words were a slap in the face. Mary's breath hitched, her eyes flickering to the window as if half expecting to see flashing lights already. But the panic quickly turned to something darker, her face twisting with rage. "You little," she choked out, but then she whirled to the guards, her voice rising into a shrill command. "Get rid of her. Now." The guards moved instantly, their grips tightening, and Ella's heart lurched as they dragged her roughly toward the door. She struggled, panic surging hot and fast, but their hands were like steel. For a sickening moment, she was sure it was over, that they'd drag her down to the basement or worse, and no one would ever hear from her again. But then, just as they reached the door, a new sound split the air, one that made everyone freeze. Sirens, loud and wailing, growing closer with every second. Mary's eyes went wide with horror, her mouth dropping open. One of the guards swore under his breath, his hands slackening on Ella's arms. The sirens were deafening now, red and blue lights flashing through the curtains, washing the walls in harsh, flickering color. Ella's breath came fast and shallow, but she forced herself to stand tall, to meet Mary's shocked, furious gaze with a glare of her own. "I told you," she bit out, her voice shaking but fierce. "It's over." The front doors of the mansion burst open with a crash, and the foyer was suddenly filled with the blinding glare of flashlights and the deafening shouts of officers. Red and blue lights pulsed wildly outside, casting jagged shadows through the windows. Guests screamed and scrambled back, glasses shattering on the marble floors, heels clicking in a panicked frenzy. Armed officers swarmed in, barking orders and shoving past waiters and businessmen in glittering suits. The music cut off abruptly, leaving only the chaos of shouting and the metallic clink of handcuffs. Mary froze at the top of the staircase, her face drained of color, fingers still clutching the USB drive so tightly her knuckles turned white. For a moment, she just stared, eyes wide and uncomprehending, as if her mind couldn't quite catch up to what was happening. But when two officers started up the stairs toward her, shouting her name, reality crashed down hard and fast. "No," she choked out, stumbling back, her heels slipping on the polished steps. You can't. This is a mistake." But the officers didn't stop. One of them grabbed her arm, wrenching it behind her back with a brutal efficiency that left her gasping in pain. The USB slipped from her hand, clattering down the steps, and Mary screamed, kicking and twisting against the cuffs that bit sharply into her wrists. "Let me go? Do you know who I am?" she shrieked. But her voice was shrill and desperate, cracking with something dangerously close to real terror. Downstairs, Mr. Richard was no better. Two officers had him pinned against the wall, reading him his rights in flat, unfeeling voices. His face was beet red with rage, spit flying as he barked threats and demands. But the words were empty, powerless. "Get your hands off me," he bellowed, eyes blazing. "I'll have your badges for this. You have no idea who you're dealing with." But his voice faltered when he saw Mary struggling, sobbing as they dragged her down the stairs in cuffs, her makeup streaked and eyes wild. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes, cracking through the fury. Then an officer stepped forward, a grim expression on his face, and held out a tablet. "Sir, I suggest you take a look at this," he said coldly. "We received this footage anonymously. It might clear a few things up." The officer tapped the screen, and the video began to play. The same one Ella had seen, the one that showed the truth. Mr. Richards' eyes narrowed at first, but as the seconds passed, his face paled. His jaw slackened, rage melting into horror, then disbelief, then something even worse. He watched his daughter slip into James's room, heard her coaxing voice, saw the way James backed away, hands up, eyes wide with confusion and alarm. He saw Mary's face twist with fury when he refused her, saw her tear at her own dress and scream, her eyes cold and calculating even as she sobbed for help. By the time the video ended, Mr. Richards' hands were shaking so badly that he nearly dropped the tablet. His legs buckled, and he staggered back, his eyes wide and haunted. "No," he whispered, voice cracking. This can't be. Mary." His gaze snapped to his daughter, who stood limp and sobbing in the officer's hold, mascara streaking down her cheeks, her eyes squeezed shut as if she could block it all out. "Tell me it's not true," he gasped, voice raw and broken. "Tell me you didn't." But Mary only shook her head, her shoulders quaking with sobs, no words coming. The realization crashed down on Mr. Richard all at once. The trials, the headlines, the years James had spent rotting in a cell for a crime he hadn't committed. The memory of James's desperate eyes, his pleas of innocence, replayed with brutal clarity. His knees gave out, and he sank to the floor, his hands clawing at his hair, breaths coming in ragged, choking gasps. Meanwhile, miles away in a dim, gray-walled prison, a guard unlocked the door to James's cell with a clang that rang through the silence. "Wilson," he barked, his tone flat but almost hesitant. "Get up. You're free to go." James blinked, sitting up slowly on the thin cot, exhaustion and disbelief dulling his eyes. For a moment, He could only stare, certain he must have misheard. What? He rasped, his voice rough from days of silence. Your conviction's been overturned, the guard said, not meeting his eyes. Someone proved you were innocent. Now get moving. The words barely registered, each one too heavy, too surreal to grasp. But when James stepped out into the hallway and saw Ella waiting, her eyes bright with relief and tears, it finally hit him. He was free. After 3 years of nightmares and cold concrete walls and empty darkness, he was free. Ella rushed forward, wrapping her arms around him in a fierce, trembling embrace. And for the first time in years, James let himself believe it was over. The courtroom was packed, cameras flashing and reporters whispering eagerly into microphones as the judge's gavel struck with a sharp crack. Mr. Richards stood at the defense table, his once proud shoulders slumped, eyes dull and hollow. The tailored suit that had always made him seem untouchable now hung loose, as if even the fabric had turned against him. Mary sat beside him in a plain dress, her wrists cuffed and her face blotchy from tears, but the eyes that stared blankly at the floor were empty of the defiance that once glittered there. The sentence was clear and merciless. Years in prison for both of them, for perjury, false accusations, and obstruction of justice. No one in the gallery flinched. James watched it all from the plaintiff's side, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, Ella's warm and steady beside his. The judge's words washed over him, final and unrelenting, but all he felt was a numb sort of relief. It was over. Mr. Richard was ordered to pay millions in compensation for the false conviction, an amount that would have seemed unimaginable to James 3 years ago. But even that seemed hollow compared to the sight of Mr. Richard being led away in cuffs, his eyes glassy with disbelief, his head bowed under the weight of his own mistakes. The news spread like wildfire. Headlines that once painted James as a monster now tore into Mr. Richard and Mary with ruthless hunger. Billionaire and daughter exposed as frauds. The papers screamed. Reporters crowded the gates of the mansion, cameras catching every angle of the estate that now seemed empty and cursed. Clips of the trial played on every channel, the damning footage of Mary's lies and Mr. Richard's blind rage dissected and analyzed by every talk show host in the country. For days, it was all anyone could talk about. James watched it from the worn couch in his mother's living room, a strange satisfaction unfurling slowly in his chest. It wasn't joy. Not really. Nothing could undo the years he had lost, the nights spent staring at cracked concrete walls, the whispers and fists and hopelessness. But there was a dark sort of justice in seeing the world turn on them just as viciously as it had turned on him. Watching their faces plastered across every screen, eyes wide with shock and shame, James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Karma had come around at last. It was a crisp morning when Lucy showed up at James's door, her eyes red-rimmed and desperate, fingers twisting nervously around the strap of her handbag. She hesitated for a long moment before knocking, her breath clouding in the chilly air, and when the door finally swung open, she nearly choked on the words she'd been rehearsing all night. James stood there, surprise flickering briefly in his eyes before his face settled into something unreadable. He looked different, stronger, steadier, the shadows beneath his eyes less dark now that the nightmare was finally over. For a moment, Lucy could only stare, her voice catching in her throat. James, she breathed, her voice trembling. Please, I just needed to see you. To tell you I'm sorry. I was wrong. I should have believed you. I should have been there. Her hands trembled as she reached for him, eyes shining with tears. If you can just forgive me, we can start over. I'll do anything to make it right. Please, James. But James only watched her, his gaze calm and steady, and the silence stretched until Lucy's face crumpled, her tears spilling over. Please, she whispered again, her voice small and broken. I love you. He let out a breath, slow and measured, and for a moment, Lucy saw something soften in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or the last shreds of the love they'd once shared. But then his expression hardened again, and he shook his head. It's too late, Lucy, he said quietly. You didn't just leave me. You destroyed me when I needed you most. I can't forget that. He hesitated, and Lucy's heart lurched with a wild, desperate hope. But then, the door behind him creaked open, and Ella stepped out, her hand warm and familiar as it slid into his. A diamond ring glinted on her finger, and the smile she gave James was soft and certain. Lucy's breath hitched, her face going pale as realization crashed down. No, she choked out. eyes wide with disbelief. You can't, you and her. Ella was the only one who believed in me, James said, his voice steady but not unkind. She never gave up, even when everyone else did. I've moved on, Lucy. You should too. And with that, he turned, his hand still firmly in Ella's, and together they walked away, leaving Lucy standing alone on the porch, the door closing softly behind them. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, warm and golden, casting soft patterns across the wooden floor. The little house was quiet and bright, nestled at the edge of a small town far from the city where everything had gone wrong. James leaned back against the counter, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands, the rich smell filling the air. For the first time in years, his shoulders didn't ache with tension, and his breaths came slow and easy. Outside, birds sang and leaves rustled softly, the world blessedly ordinary. Ella moved around the kitchen, humming softly as she poured cereal into a bowl, her hair falling in soft waves down her back. The diamond ring on her finger caught the light, glinting brightly, and James's chest warmed at the sight. Every now and then, she'd glance back at him, eyes bright and warm, and he couldn't help but smile. The nightmares had started to fade, replaced by mornings like this, filled with sunlight and quiet laughter and the smell of breakfast. The TV on the counter murmured with low voices, news anchors discussing stocks and weather and scandals in polished tones. James's gaze drifted absently to the screen just as a familiar headline flashed by. Billionaire and daughter sentenced to prison, justice finally served. The camera cut to grainy footage of Mary and Mr. Richard being led out of the courtroom in cuffs, faces pale and eyes hollow, reporters shouting questions that went unanswered. Their eyes were haunted, their clothes wrinkled and worn, a far cry from the immaculate perfection they once flaunted. For a moment, James just watched, the coffee warm between his palms, the words sinking in slowly. 3 years of darkness, of metal bars and cold walls and whispers that followed him everywhere, erased in a few short seconds of footage. He let out a breath, slow and steady, and a smile touched his lips, not bitter or angry, but calm, as if the weight had finally lifted. Ella looked over at him, eyebrows raised slightly in question. James met her eyes, warmth spreading through his chest, and his smile widened just a little. Justice was finally served, he said softly, the words steady and sure, and for the first time in years, he truly believed them.